Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I am Stuart Frank, Director of the Agricultural Marketing Service, Packers and Stockyards Division. Welcome to our second briefing on the final rule, transparency in poultry grower contracting and tournaments. This webinar session is being recorded. A link to the webinar recording will be made available following the broadcast to all registrants. To reduce background noise, your microphone has been muted. Your video feed is also blocked. We do this to protect the privacy of all our attendees. You have the option to activate closed captioning to appear along the bottom of your viewing screen. Click on the CC option located on the toolbar along the bottom of your monitor. We will not be using the chat room today, but the question and answer box will be open throughout the presentation. Please take a moment to locate the Q&A option located on the toolbar at the bottom of your monitor. Please enter any questions or comments using the Q&A box. You may choose to enter them anonymously by checking the anonymous box before clicking send. At the end of today's webinar, we will address questions that were submitted prior to the presentation. We will supplement the set of frequently asked questions, FAQs, from those previously submitted from today's webinar. The FAQs are posted on the AMS website. With that, we will now begin our presentation. The Poultry Transparency Final Rule was published November 28, 2023, and became effective February 12, 2024. Joining me today is Billy Brake, Packers and Stockyards Senior Regulatory Policy Specialist, and Tom Dugan, Packers and Stockyards Director of the Competition Branch. During the presentation, we will provide an overview of the rule, the specifics of the rule, and at the end of today's webinar, we will address some of the questions that were submitted prior to the presentation. Now, I'm going to turn over this to Billy Brake to begin the discussion of the critical information that live poultry dealers, LPDs, must provide poultry growers with whom they contract to raise birds. Billy?
Thank you, Stuart. This final rule establishes certain requirements on live poultry dealers, also known as integrators. AMS intends this rule to make poultry growing a more transparent business that works for everyone, such that growers better understand the contents of their production agreements, and are empowered to enforce them. AMS's broad objective with this rule is to inhibit deceptive practices in poultry contracting and provide poultry growers with the information they need to make informed business decisions. Renee, can you move the slide? It won't let me. Thank you. The final rule has two main parts. The first part of the rule, the disclosure document, ensures that growers are provided with appropriate disclosures related to their production agreements. The second part of the rule ensures growers receive vital information about the inputs they receive under a poultry growing ranking system, also known as a tournament. Here's a brief overview of some background that informed this rulemaking. Growers make large financial investments in poultry growing facilities that create significant financial risk. Typically, the revenues generated from these business agreements are crucial for the growers so that they can meet loan payments and other financial obligations necessary for solvency. Integrators control the provision of inputs such as chicks, medication, and feed to growers. Numerous growers have complained to USDA and the Department of Justice that when negotiating contracts, growers lack the information they need, such as how many placements they'll receive annually the stocking density of those placements, and then also lack insight into the types of inputs they received that is part of the comparison by which they are paid in the tournament pools. When these items are absent in contracts, risk is created that can disadvantage growers in the management of their farming operation. By establishing a higher level of transparency in contracting, AMS is setting a new industry standard. Transparency is not new to poultry. Live poultry dealers are already required to disclose certain information. With this rule, AMS has revised and expanded the list of required disclosures to enhance the fair operation of poultry production agreements. In the next few slides, we'll go over the specifics in this rule. There are two main parts: the live poultry dealer disclosure document, which should be provided to growers at the time of contracting, renewal, or revision, and the tournament disclosures, which are provided to growers at flock placement and collectively at settlement. Before we go into the disclosure document itself, let me note an exemption that exists. I do want to note integrators producing under 2 million live pounds weekly are not required to provide the disclosure document to growers. So growers contracting with integrators of this size would not receive a disclosure document. Whether you've been offered your first poultry contract or you're signing your 15th, this rule requires the integrator to provide you with a disclosure document. It also applies to contract revisions and renewals. So what's in the document? We'll leave that off right here. It includes many items that are relevant to grower informed decision-making. One of the more important components of this document are the minimum number of bird placements per year and the stocking density. Note, this rule also necessitates the inclusion of annual placements and stocking density in production agreements. Hopefully, many of you have seen these items added to your contracts. Let me pause to make a couple points on those addendums and amendments under the guise of this rule. The requirement in this rule is to disclose the minimums in existing contracts. Often, the existing contract language is highly qualified and arguably unenforceable. This requirement remedies that issue. If you have been offered an addendum or an amendment that differs from your understanding of your existing contract, that could be the reason. I encourage all concerned growers to talk with their integrators and their lenders about their existing contracts and any documents used to support potential revenues from those operations. And of course, please direct any complaints to AMS for further review. If you have been offered an addendum or an amendment that goes beyond the two requirements under this rule, it may be a contract modification. This rule does not require growers to agree to contract modifications. Continuing with the contents of the disclosure document. This document will also provide information about the integrator's prior bankruptcies and litigation history, integrator's policies and procedures regarding any potential sale of broiler growers' farms, contact information for local USDA extension and other external resources, as well as grower turnover ratio and financial disclosures. Let me highlight one additional point before I turn this presentation over to Tom to explain the value and use of turnover ratio and the financial disclosures in this rule. When a live poultry dealer provides the disclosure document to growers, those disclosures are required to be accurate. Live poultry dealer is required to keep records and have their principal executive officer confirm the accuracy and honesty of that document. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tom for further insight into the grower turnover ratio and the financial disclosures that are found in the disclosure document.
Thank you, Billy. Next slide, please. So I'd like to talk about the average annual turnover rates disclosure you will see So under this rule, live poultry dealers are required to disclose to growers a table showing the average annual broiler grower turnover rates for the previous calendar year and the average of the 5 previous years at a company level and at a local complex level. And I want to step you through the calculation because I think it's important to see what's in the calculation in order to correctly interpret the rate. So the calculation of the grower turnover rate is equal to the number of grower separations in a particular time period divided by the average number of growers in the same time period times 100. There's 2 time periods here. The first time period is the previous year. The second time period is the average of the previous 5 calendar years. The number of separations includes terminations, non-renewals, retirements, growers switching to another integrator, etc. It includes all reasons that growers separate. So for a previous year example, at the company level, there were 12 grower separations at all complexes and an average of 260 growers. So the company grower turnover rate would be 12 divided by 260 times 100 would equal 4.6%. At the local complex for the grower, let's say there were 3 grower separations and an average of 75 growers at that complex during the previous calendar year. Then the grower turnover rate at the complex would be 3 divided by 75 times 100 would equal 4%. Next, please. So here's an example of what growers should receive from their integrator. Here's the table. Here's an example table. Should have the company name, and it should have the previous year annual grower turnover rate at the company level. Say, for example, 4.6%. The 5-year average annual grower turnover rate, 4.2%, for example. Then you should see it at your local complex. As an example, this is Complex 1 in Atlanta, Georgia. So the previous year annual grower turnover rate, for example, is 4.0% at this complex, while the 5-year average annual grower turnover rate at the complex is 3.5%. So what are the uses of this for growers? Growers can use this to compare turnover rates of multiple integrators as a consideration in assessing relative risk of termination or non-renewal when making contracting decisions. It's also a metric for grower satisfaction with live poultry dealers. The turnover rate, we've got to disclose this, includes retirements and growers that switched to another integrator. That's important because a high turnover rate may prompt growers to ask their integrator about the high rate. It could be due to a high number of retirements, or it could be due to a high number of terminations. So I think it just should suggest a conversation with your integrator about a high turnover rate. Next, please. So financial disclosures, these are some very important disclosures. So live poultry dealers are required to provide growers with the following financial disclosures. Tables showing average annual gross payments to broiler growers at the local complex for each of the 5 previous years. The tables must be expressed in average payments in US dollars per farm facility square foot. The tables must be organized to show the year, the housing specification tier from lowest to highest, and the distribution of payments by either quintiles for complexes with 10 or more growers, which is the most likely situation, or the mean and 1 standard deviation for complexes with 9 or fewer growers. And I'll explain why that distinction is important in a minute. So here's an example. I guess before the example, it begs the question, what's a quintile? It is a statistical value that represents 20% of a given population. Here, a quintile would show the average annual gross payments per square foot earned by the lowest to highest 20% of growers. So here's an example table that you might see. In this first column, it contains complex and housing information. So the complex name and the location. The second column shows the quintiles ranked from the first quintile, which is the lowest 20% of average annual gross payments, ranging all the way to the highest 20% of average annual gross payments. And the values of the average annual gross payments per square foot are in the third column. I should note the first column is also for housing specification A. You should receive a table for each different housing specification at your particular complex. So in this particular example, the lowest 20% of growers should earn on average in the previous calendar year, which in this example is 2023, $1.33 per farm facility square foot. The middle quintile has earned in the past calendar year an average of $1.61 per farm facility square foot. The highest quintile, the highest 20% earners earned $2.09 per farm facility square foot. Next, please. So the tables will show mean and standard deviation for complexes with 9 or fewer growers. The reason that is it protects grower payment information. Because if there's 9 or fewer growers in any particular complex, one of the quintiles would necessarily contain the specific information for only one grower. So we don't want anybody's specific payment information to be disclosed. So the way around that is for complexes with 9 or fewer growers, these tables will show the mean, which is simply the average, and the standard deviation from the mean. So standard deviation is simply a measure of dispersion from the mean. It's a measure of how far average annual gross payments to growers are away from the average. If it's a small number, everything's grouped pretty tight. Everyone's grouped pretty tightly around the mean. The larger, there's more dispersion around the mean. So how can growers use these quintile tables? Why are they useful? The tables show the full range of payment outcomes that growers can expect. It helps current and prospective growers understand and compare income variations and evaluate their own income variation risk. It enables growers to evaluate whether potential earnings are sufficient to cover financial obligations. You can do a worst case scenario. If you're in the lowest quintile, is that enough to cover financial obligations? How do things look if you expect to be in the middle quintile or at the upper quintile? So it enables growers to make better financial decisions. Next slide, please. There's some other additional useful information that live poultry dealers are required to disclose to growers. In the case that housing specifications for growers under contract are modified such that an additional capital investment may be required, or if the 5-year averages do not accurately represent projected grower payments, the live poultry dealers must provide to growers tables with projections of average annual gross payments to growers under contract with the complex with the same housing specifications and an example of why the average annual gross payments for the previous 5 years do not provide an accurate representation of projected future payments. And this must also include the basic assumptions underlying those projections. Some other additional useful information is that integrators must provide a summary of information the live poultry dealer collects or maintains relating to grower variable costs inherent in broiler production, things like fuel costs. This helps growers better understand cash flow. With that, I'd like to turn it back over to Billy to talk through tournament-specific disclosures.
Thanks, Tom. The tournament-specific disclosures are required. There we go. Are required when poultry growers are paid using a poultry growing ranking system, defined in this rule as payment based on a ranking, grouping, or relative comparison of growers. You may have heard this referenced as a tournament system. Specifically, growers would receive critical information about the type or nature of the inputs individually at placement and then collectively at settlement. Within 24 hours of flock placement, growers will receive information on the ratios of breeds of the poultry delivered, the ratios of male and female poultry delivered, unless that placement was a straight run, the breeder facility the chicks come from, the breeder flock's age, any known health impairments to those chicks, and any adjustments if the live poultry dealer intends to make those adjustments in calculation of the grower's pay based upon those inputs. At settlement, the rule would also require disclosures to the entire settlement pool that show the distribution of inputs on the prior slide, the housing specifications of pool participants, and any feed disruptions for all the growers in the tournament with their names redacted, consistent with current policy in ranking sheets. USDA designed these settlement disclosures to prevent deception and give growers the opportunity to understand the relative importance of inputs and housing investments. Growers can use the disclosures to plan and improve their performance. We hope this presentation has been helpful in better understanding the poultry transparency rule. This concludes our overview of the rule, and now I will turn it back over to Tom for a Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you, Billy. I'd like to talk through a few answers to some of the questions we received when you registered for this webinar. The first question is about the application of the rule. The question is, does the final rule apply to all poultry, including broilers, turkeys, ducks, etc.? The answer is that this rule only applies to live poultry dealers that contract with broiler growers. What's that mean for you as a broiler grower? Only broiler growers will receive the disclosures required by the rule. Turkey growers would not likely be receiving this disclosures. They're not required to be disclosed to turkey growers. Only broiler growers are required to be provided with these disclosures. The second question has to do with what changes to poultry growing contracts can growers expect because of this rule? And that would be broiler growers again. This rule will increase transparency in contracting terms for broiler growers, including in the contract, you will see the minimum number of annual poultry placements at the grower's facility and the minimum stocking density for each flock placed. Next question, please. So this question has to do with contract evaluation periods. The question is, how many days in advance should a live poultry dealer provide to growers the required disclosures before executing a new or revised contract? The answer is live poultry dealers are required to provide growers with the disclosures and the contract at least 14 days before executing the contract. However, the grower may waive up to 7 of those 14 days. This requirement provides time for growers to adequately review the documents and make decisions. Next question, please. This question has to do with tournament contracts and what type and when do integrators have to provide the placement and settlement disclosures that Billy just described. So the question is, what types of broiler growing contracts require live poultry dealers to supply placement and settlement disclosures to growers? The answer is only broiler contracts that use poultry growing ranking system or a tournament to calculate grower payments. Only those contracts are required to provide these placement and settlement disclosures. Thus, it really applies to relative performance contracts only. In the rule, we define that to be a contract where payment is based upon a grouping, a ranking, or comparison of poultry growers delivering poultry during a specified time period. What this means is that live poultry dealers are not required to provide tournament disclosures to growers under fixed performance contracts, square footage contracts, for example. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Billy to take a few more questions.
Thanks, Tom. Next question, when does a feed outage begin for the purposes of the disclosure requirement in the tournament specific disclosures? And the answer is that this disclosure is designed to capture situations where birds are without feed for 12 or more hours, regardless of who's at fault. The intent is to identify feed outages that may affect a grower's performance. The broader point is for the settlement pool participants to be able to identify feed outages and assess any potential effect on tournament performance. And one last question, sort of to reiterate one item that we've talked about a few times today. Are growers required to sign contract amendments proffered as necessary under this rule? AMS takes no position on whether growers should sign these documents, but notes the rule does not require a change in the existing contract obligations. Unfortunately, many growers may have been led to believe they will receive a specific number of placements, only to find out later that the contract completely disclaims that specific number. Contract amendments that go beyond the minimum disclosures required in this rule require the mutual assent of growers to be effective. If growers are concerned about retaliation related to refusals to sign contract amendments, AMS directs growers to review the Inclusive Competition Market Integrity final rule that was announced earlier this week. That rule specifically prohibits retaliation. We thank you for submitting questions, and we look forward to addressing any additional questions you may have related to this rule. I will now turn this back over to Stuart for closing remarks.
Thank you, Billy. You may submit any questions you have about the poultry transparency rule to the AMS-ask psd@usda.gov email. This email can also be found on the AMS Fair Trade Practices Packers and Stockyards Division Contact Packers and Stockyards webpage. We will supplement the FAQs with any new questions received today or through the Ask PSD email. On December 20th, 2023, we held our first webinar to introduce the Poultry Transparency Final Rule to stakeholders. That webinar, along with links to additional information, including the text of the final and proposed rule, webinar information, a poultry grower fact sheet, and FAQs can be found online using the QR code on the last slide of this presentation. This is the last slide of the presentation, so you can scan the QR code on the screen now to go to the AMS Packers and Stockyards webpage to view the information and materials for the Poultry Transparency Rule. I want to thank you again for joining us today for our webinar on the Transparency in Poultry Grower Contracting and Tournaments Rule. Again, a recording of today's webinar will be available on the AMS Packers and Stockyards webpage. This concludes today's webinar. Thank you.